There's a moment in most people's lives when they're forced to see themselves the way others do. For some, it happens in a mirror. For others, it's much more painful. On a Saturday evening in October, a woman stood outside one of the most prestigious hotels in the country wearing jeans and a worn sweatshirt. A security guard looked through her like she was made of glass. What that guard didn't know would reshape the entire night. Let me tell you about the person most people never actually see. She runs a $17 billion operation that touches hundreds of thousands of lives every single year, but nobody knows her face. Her name is Kinsley Wong. She's 32 years old, and she built a hospitality empire so massive that if you've traveled across America in the last decade, you've probably slept in one of her beds without ever knowing it. The irony is almost mathematical. The more successful she became, the more invisible she had to be. She started 8 years ago with a single failing property that cost her every dollar she'd saved, and then some. The financing kept her awake at night for months. She renovated it herself, learning alongside electricians and plumbers, understanding the business not from textbooks, but from sweat and failure and trial. That hotel became profitable. Then it became the foundation for another acquisition, then another. The growth wasn't explosive in the way tech startups are. It was methodical, strategic, the kind of expansion that only happens when someone understands every level of their operation because they've worked every level. Kinsley had a sister named Madison. Madison worked in marketing at a respectable firm and was very good at one particular skill, managing appearances. 2 weeks before this engagement party, Madison called with a specific request. She wanted Kinsley to show up looking like she had her life together. Madison used actual air quotes over the phone when she mentioned Kinsley's little online business thing. The irony, of course, was that Madison's career trajectory looked modest compared to what Kinsley had actually accomplished. But Madison didn't know that. Nobody in the family really did. Kinsley had been trying to tell them, every family dinner, every phone call, but Madison would change the subject whenever Kinsley brought up work. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was something closer to willful ignorance. Madison was engaged to a man named Brett Ashford. The Ashfords were old money, or at least they had been. What Kinsley discovered in the weeks leading up to the engagement party painted a specific financial picture. The family's Connecticut estate carried 3 mortgages. Brett's trust fund had been liquidated years ago. 15 credit cards were maxed out between them. They were drowning. Not subtly, not hidden. They were simply drowning quietly, maintaining appearances while water filled their lungs. And they'd identified Madison as a potential life raft. The day of the party, Kinsley made a deliberate choice. She wore old jeans, an ancient college sweatshirt, and beat-up sneakers. She wanted to understand how people would treat her when they made assumptions about her worth. The security guard at the Grand Meridian made his calculations instantly. His face told her everything. She wasn't worth his respect. She was worth directing to the service entrance. What's fascinating is that Kinsley didn't fight it. She accepted it, because she already owned the building. She walked through that side door and into the kitchen where controlled chaos had become an art form. A chef named Felipe took one look at her and assigned her to shrimp duty. Within minutes, she was elbow-deep in work, invisible, listening. The kitchen staff were gossiping about Madison's behavior. 3 champagne deliveries rejected for color, 17 menu changes, a pastry chef who'd been reduced to tears over cake designs. But the real story was about the Ashfords. When Mrs. Ashford arrived to inspect the venue, she spent 40 minutes name-dropping dead relatives and explaining how their family had been throwing parties since before the hotel was even built. The message was clear. We are important. We matter. Respect us. But Kinsley understood something deeper about status. People who actually possess it rarely have to announce it. The need to announce it is usually a sign that it's slipping away. Madison, on the other hand, was trying desperately to live up to a fantasy version of the Ashfords. She was performing constantly, adjusting her posture, laughing too loudly, scrambling to meet standards that were fundamentally impossible to achieve. Because those standards didn't actually exist. They were being invented moment by people who were terrified of being exposed. As the party progressed, Kinsley noticed something deliberate happening.
Mrs. Ashford handed cash to a man who wasn't part of the catering staff. She gave him instructions. She pointed at various areas of the ballroom. Kinsley pulled up the security footage and watched the interaction. Mrs. Ashford was orchestrating something, a sabotage, Kinsley eventually realized. Something designed to make Madison look bad, something meant to drive her son away from this engagement. Not because Madison wasn't good enough, but because Madison's money, which didn't actually exist, was supposed to rescue them from bankruptcy. That's when Kinsley understood the full architecture of the deception. Madison was lying about who she was, the Ashfords were lying about who they were, and everyone was so focused on the performance that nobody was actually present in the moment. Kinsley had access to resources most people don't. She made phone calls, she pulled public records, she accessed information that was technically available to anyone willing to search for it. The Ashfords had tried to hire a private investigator to look into Madison's background. The invoice was charged to a maxed-out credit card. They were that desperate. Back in the ballroom, Madison was announcing that her extremely successful investor sister was somewhere at the party, observing everything, ready to make a significant announcement. Madison was using Kinsley as a prop, not knowing Kinsley was standing 10 feet away in a server's uniform, holding a tray of crab cakes that Mrs. Ashford had loudly dismissed as pedestrian. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. Chase Ashford, Brett's brother, cornered Kinsley near the service station and offered her money to connect later. He had the confidence of someone who'd never experienced actual consequences. His cryptocurrency ventures had collapsed 3 months ago. His trust fund was depleted. He was like a character from a play, performing wealth without understanding what wealth actually was.
The moment came during the toast. David, Kinsley's general manager, appeared at the ballroom entrance holding a folder. The Ashford's payment check had bounced. Kinsley could have let him handle it quietly, could have protected Madison from the humiliation that was about to occur. She didn't. Instead, she untied her apron, she folded it neatly, she handed it to a passing server, and then she addressed the room. "My name is Kinsley Wong. I own this hotel. I own all 17 Grand Meridian hotels." The silence was absolute. Kinsley connected her phone to the ballroom's AV system and began playing security footage on the massive screens. There was Mrs. Ashford handing cash to the staff member. There was Mrs. Ashford going through Madison's purse, photographing documents. There was the audio file of Madison that had been edited to make her sound dishonest, ready to be played through the sound system as part of the sabotage. The room transformed in seconds from celebration to courtroom. Mrs. Ashford tried to explain, but explanation became impossible when the evidence is literally larger than life on screens surrounding you. Kinsley projected the public records onto those same screens. Property records, court documents, the kind of information anyone could find if they bothered to look. 3 mortgages, depleted trust funds, 15 maxed credit cards, a family in the final stages of financial collapse, masquerading as stability. The party cost $47,000. The Ashfords couldn't pay it. Kinsley absorbed the cost as a wedding gift, contingent on the Ashfords leaving quietly and never returning to the hotel. They left quietly. Brett stood up and looked directly at Madison. He told her he had no idea about his parents' schemes. He said he understood if she wanted to call off the engagement. Madison looked at him, then at Kinsley, then back at him. "Your parents are terrible," she said, "like spectacularly terrible. But you stood up to them, and you're nothing like them." It wasn't romantic, it was honest, which in that moment meant something much deeper. After the ballroom emptied, Madison approached Kinsley. She was crying. She was devastated, but she was also present in a way she hadn't been all evening. "Why didn't you tell me?" Madison asked. "I tried to tell you multiple times, but every time I brought up work, you changed the subject." Madison looked at the ground. She wasn't angry. She was processing the fact that her sister had been building an empire while Madison was busy building a fantasy. The next morning, Kinsley offered Madison a job, not out of charity, but because someone who could orchestrate that many moving pieces, even disastrously, had potential. Madison would start at the bottom: housekeeping, kitchen, front desk, every department. She would learn the business from the ground up, and she would apologize to every person she'd mistreated. Brett joined her. He'd been living off his family's reputation his entire life without actually knowing how to build anything. He had a finance degree he'd never been allowed to use. Kinsley put him in accounting. For the first time in their lives, they were building something that was actually theirs. The guard who'd redirected Kinsley to the service entrance found her as she was leaving the hotel. He apologized 17 times in 30 seconds. He'd realized during the chaos of the evening who she actually was. Kinsley told him he was just doing his job, but maybe next time he should look at people's faces instead of their clothes. He nodded so hard she thought his head might snap off. 2 months later, the Ashfords lost their Connecticut estate for foreclosure. Mrs. Ashford attempted to sue Kinsley for defamation. It's very difficult to successfully claim defamation when everything said about you is documented on video and supported by public records. They moved to Florida, where they're presumably still attempting to identify families with money and eligible children.
Madison started her first shift in housekeeping at 5 in the morning. She texted Kinsley a picture of herself in the uniform, smiling despite the early hour. "Day 1 of learning who I actually am," she wrote. A year later, Madison and Brett got married in a simple ceremony in Kinsley's hotel garden. Madison insisted on using the service entrance for her bridal entrance. She said it was where her real journey had actually begun. Here's what's interesting about this entire sequence of events. Kinsley had the power to stop the humiliation at any moment. She could have revealed herself immediately. She could have protected her sister from public exposure. She didn't. Instead, she chose to let Madison experience the full weight of her own behavior. She chose to show her family exactly what happened when you build your life on performance instead of authenticity. Was that mercy? Was that punishment? Was it both? The wealthier Kinsley became, the more invisible she had to be. She owned 17 hotel properties worth billions. She employed thousands of people. She shaped the daily experience of hundreds of thousands of guests. But nobody knew her face. Nobody knew her name. She existed in the background of other people's lives. Madison had spent her entire life trying to be visible, trying to be seen as impressive and important, and she'd been miserable. Kinsley had spent her entire life becoming invisible, becoming the infrastructure beneath other people's experiences, and she'd built an empire. The security guard who turned Kinsley away at the beginning of this story was just doing what he was trained to do: make assumptions based on appearances, categorize people based on surface-level information, decide who belongs and who doesn't. He wasn't a bad person. He was just operating within a system that rewards visual judgments and punishes uncertainty. But here's what actually happened that night. The person he deemed least important was actually the most powerful person in that building. The people he treated as impressive were actually desperate. The person performing wealth had none. The person performing invisibility had everything. We spend so much energy trying to signal who we are. We curate our appearance, we announce our accomplishments, we perform for an audience that isn't even watching. And sometimes the people who are actually building something real aren't interested in the performance at all. Sometimes they're just watching, learning, understanding the system so completely that they can move through it without needing to be seen. That's the thing nobody tells you about actual power.
It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need validation or recognition. It just moves quietly in the background, changing everything.